Good morning, Outrank. I want to do an audit on a website, bariatriceating.com. Sorry for the quiet talking. It's 5 a.m. as the time I'm recording this, and my family's still asleep. Don't want to wake up the kids and the wife. So, bariatriceating.com, man, this is a massively successful website. Super impressive about the sales volume these guys do, and I've had the pleasure of working with them over the years. And right now, they are considering some site redesigns, and so we are working with them. I'm doing a mobile-first audit for them. And so we want to look at what opportunities there are to improve the page speed and the mobile friendliness. And I thought while I'm going through this, I would record this and share some of what I'm going to look at and build out a roadmap for them. And hopefully you can take away some insights from this. So they have, excuse me, what I consider kind of two components to their website, two sections. So they have their, we'll call it the content side of their website, and this is WordPress based. So their homepage, recipes, just like I said, content. And then they have their storefront side. And so if we go to shop.bariatriceating.com, you'll see very similar design. It's pretty seamless. There's very little difference. And so people don't really know. Consumers don't notice that the back end is changing, but this runs on a totally different cart platform. Now, what we want to look at is a couple things. There's the two go-to tools. You know, a lot of people go to Google's mobile friendly test, which is fine. I'm not a big fan of it, but I'll explain that more later. One area that I like to look at, one resource that I really like to use for page speed, which is a big part of mobile rankings and friendliness, is gtmetrics.com. So when we look at this, there's primarily two things that I look at. And so I ran these reports for their main site and their shop site. And there's the three things I look at are this page speed score, the Y slow score, and then the fully loaded time. Now, the most important of those three is the fully loaded time. And what fully loaded means is, you know, the website, when you go to it, it doesn't look like it takes 11 seconds before you start seeing content. So the key phrase is fully loaded. And what that means is how long does it take until the entire page is complete and stops loading scripts. So you might see above the fold load pretty quickly, but then further down the page where you can't see because you haven't scrolled yet, there's content that's still loading. And so that's the part that it's saying is taking longer. Now these two scores contribute to this. That's why this is ultimately the most important part. So what we look at is enable gzip compression. That's going to be either on the host or the back end, and so you can look at the resources that are triggering that. So it looks like a lot of the caching is related to the theme, and so we can try and cache the theme's template files and style sheets. Serve resources from a consistent URL. So it looks like it's loading some images from bariatriceating.com and then shop.bariatriceating.com. In this case, that's okay. So I'm not going to do anything about that because both of those assets are the client's website. They just, as I mentioned, part of their website runs on WordPress and the other part runs on a cart. Serve scaled images. This is one of my go-tos. This shows up on almost every website. So what this means is, as you can see here, an image is displaying at 251 by 291, but its raw size is 1036 by 1200. So the browser of your customers has to load this full 1036 by 1200 image, but then it has to shrink down the display size to 251 by 291. So to display such a small image, it has to load such a large image to do that. So let's look at it. So it's this chocolate drink. So right here you can see that image, this space is relatively small, but that image was relatively big. So let's do this so you can kind of see it better. So you can see that massive image. Your browser has to load that large of an image just to display it in that small of a space. So it's causing unnecessary load. So what you want to do is you want to resize these images to the smallest version needed to display properly in the page. So you would actually resize that to 251 by 291 and then re-upload that. I'm gonna save this image because I'm gonna show you something else here in a minute. Sorry for the coughs and the hacks. I just was getting over sick from the other day. Excuse me, getting over from being sick just the other day. Leverage browser caching. So this is kind of the same thing as gzip compression as far as how you enable it. It's either on the back end, so within WordPress you can enable caching. I used to be a big fan of W3 Total Cache. It's still a great plugin, but lately I've been more of a fan of WP Fastest Cache as a plugin. Now the reason why is because when you cache files, especially JavaScript or CSS files, sometimes it can break the layout of the page. So if you're not careful with what you're doing after you turn it on, go check your page and make sure everything loads properly. W3 Total Cache has a lot of variables to work with, which is cool, but unless you are familiar with all those variables, you can break your site layout pretty frequently. And so WP Fastest Cache seems to not only be more simple to work with, but it actually seemed to have a bigger savings on page load. So simpler, more effective. So lately I've been using WP Fastest Cache for a plugin on WordPress-based sites. Defer parsing of JavaScript. There's a lot of scripts on this site because they do a lot of tracking, a lot of ads. And so what defer means is delay, basically. So you want to delay these scripts. Let's see if I have some open here. So like here, if we look at the source of their website, there's a lot of scripts. So MailChimp, PayPal, some other miscellaneous scripts. So what I'm going to suggest to them is to move that to the bottom of the page. And that's likely contributing to page speed, because what happens is, as we looked at this score, the page, when it starts to load all this content and it hits these scripts, it has to finish loading these scripts before it's going to finish loading the body. And so if you can defer and delay those scripts until the end of the page, then the site can load all the other content quicker. Optimize images. So this is why I saved that little image on my desktop. Optimize images means you want to compress it. So you'd be surprised at how much content is actually often hidden on images. Let's see if this is an example. So when you compress an image, it tries to remove all this data. So it does two things. It tries to remove data, and then there's like a mathematical calculation. When you look at colors, there's a mathematical calculation of how often should it show this brown here versus this red here. And so the two things that compression tries to do is basically minimize that equation, that mathematical equation, so it's simpler. So it's easier to load the color scheme of an image. And then it also tries to remove all this data. So this image didn't have any sample data on here, but you can see by looking at all these, this is an EXIF editor. EXIF is that hidden metadata on an image. So there could be all this stuff. The artist could be bariatric eating, or even Damon Burton, and whatever, bariatric eating. So all this images, and then usually where I see a lot of metadata is down here in the photography information. So it could have camera settings, your GPS location. This often shows up a lot if a picture was taken on a phone. So if your phone has GPS enabled, or 4G, it'll oftentimes capture that data. And so all that information has to be stored somewhere, and it's stored in the image. So compressing it will eliminate that data, and it'll minimize that mathematical calculation. So even though we don't have metadata on there, I'm going to still smush this. So I use a plugin. I'm on a Mac. I use a plugin called Image Optim, and so you can see that saved 3%. Now, not massive savings on that particular image, but a lot of the times I've seen savings upwards of 97% on an image. And so when you multiply that over by, if you multiply that over by how many images there are on a page, so these guys have a lot of images, that savings is going to add up. Actually, why don't I just show you? Let me just save all these images. Now what's cool about Image Optim is I don't have to go through and separate all these HTML files from the images. I can just drop this whole folder in here, and it'll only hit the images. And then if there was a folder structure in here too, it'll keep the images in their hierarchy, so I don't have to go selectively find the images, compress them, and then go selectively load them back to my website. If I downloaded an images directory via FTP and there was folders and subfolders, I could just download the whole top folder, compress them all, and then load the whole thing back, because Image Optim is going to keep them in the proper hierarchy. So as this is running, you can see that there's pretty significant percentage savings, and almost every image so far has at least something it's saving. So when you multiply that by all the images on a page and all the pages on a website, that can add up quite a bit. So if you're on a Windows, KCM I think is the correct spelling for another compression tool. Yeah, right here, KCM. So there's another image compression tool if you're on Windows. All right, so back to this report. Minify JavaScript, minify CSS. That's kind of what I was just talking about on the image, where there's an equation to how content is laid out. And so actually I can give you an example. If you're familiar with CSS, so you might have a font that has a color of black. And so in your CSS it says color equals, and then you got your 6 zeros. So one example of what minification does on CSS is it says, hey, we can just cut this down to 3 zeros and it's still going to display the same black color. So when you have this big, huge, long CSS file, and there's tons of references of colors or any CSS that it can abbreviate, that adds up to page speed too. So that's kind of, the rest is pretty decent on this report, so I'll skip over the rest of that. Same kind of information on this other, on their cart. I got this backwards here. So serve scaled images, minimize redirects. That's their tracking code, so you can't really do a lot about third-party tracking codes. Optimize images, we just talked about compressing. So all that other stuff we talked about. Now, if we looked at the mobile-friendly test, the reason why I'm not a big fan of Google's mobile-friendly test is it's pretty generic. So right here it just says page is mobile friendly, yay. It doesn't really give specifics on how to fix it like GTmetrix does. Now, obviously GTmetrix isn't focused on the user interface, and Google's mobile friendly test is probably a little more on the user interface side until you actually dig into the details. So when I start to click on the details, then it gives me a bunch of script stuff. So it's not really, like on this side it tries to look like it's giving you user interface tips, but then when you actually look for any specifics, then it gives you code advice. So it's just kind of wacky to me. So page partially loaded, 25 page resources couldn't be loaded. These are all third-party tracking scripts, so there's nothing you can do about those. So on this one we learned essentially nothing. And then if we click on the usability details, clickable elements are too close together. So if we expand this to see on what page, see if I'm still logged in, it says like just this one particular page. So if we were to look at this page, what it's saying is things are kind of too close. So let me see if I can open up on this other screen, and I'll give you an example of what's too close. So this isn't the exact page that it's saying on this report, because that page is kind of taking forever. But if I scale this down to mobile friendly, you can see like all these things are pretty tight. So I do agree that that's a concern, because if you're on a mobile device, that doesn't give you a lot of flexibility to not fat finger and screw something up and accidentally click on the wrong thing. So that's what it's saying, is that the usability isn't the best. So like this is the page it was saying elements are too close on. Like it told us like one page that's pretty useless and didn't give us a lot of information that is relevant to the site design in general. So it's just not that helpful. So if we look at so that was the shop page. This is the main site now. And then sometimes it does stupid stuff like this too. So this is not showing the mobile friendly version. And so when I go look at the web page, well, I just showed you the mobile friendly version where it had the elements too close. So this is their Googlebot fetched this and the CSS was off. And I don't know why it shows this, and half the time it does show this when I check a website on mobile friendly test. So again, that's why I'm not a big fan of this mobile friendly test. So if we look at the details, same kind of thing. Pages couldn't be reloaded or loaded. Third-party scripts. The scripts are probably blocking it. There's a few down here that look legit. These are images, but it says other error. So it's not telling us anything. Then right here, Google blocked by robots text. So we did that on purpose. So there's just no insights that are beneficial here. Come down here, text too small to read. We look at it and it's like the search results page. And so it's saying it's too small to read because when Googlebot scans the search results page, it's empty. So there's nothing on there. Viewport not set. It's, you don't, on a responsive website, you don't really need to set the viewport. Excuse me, because if you do it right, it's responsive. So it's kind of silly. So anyway, what I'm going to suggest to these guys is compress images, scale them down, space things out a little bit better, improve the space and where images, how tight they are together. I'm also going to suggest that when possible, so see all these banners, these are all the text on these are on images and they're not actually text, so search engines can't really read those. So I'm going to suggest that they separate the text from the images and have them actually be text, and so that'll minimize some of the pixel count on the images too, which will ever so slightly improve the the image load, but more importantly, search engines can read the text. There's some statistics on sliders as well, that, you know, if you want to read a good article, you can search Yoast sliders suck. So Yoast is the developer of the WordPress plugin Yoast SEO. But if you search that and click on sliders suck and should be banned from your website, this is a good summary of how I feel about sliders too. And basically what they say in this article is that, you know, nobody really, statistically speaking, right here, only 1% of people actually click on a slide. So very few people are going to be sitting here and going, oh, what's on the next slide, and waiting for it. And so if people aren't doing that, why is it there? Because then the second problem it creates is it adds to the page load. So I don't know how many sliders are in here. Let's say there's 5. The website has to preload all 5 images. So it's waiting on 5 images to load, even though it's only going to display one at a time. So I'm going to suggest minimizing the slider count or eliminating it entirely. And another argument I've heard is, like, basically the reason why you have sliders is because you have a lack of focus, and you have a lot of information that you want to share with your customers, which is understandable, but you need to pick focus, right? And so what I'm going to suggest is whittling it down to whatever the primary goal is. And in here it looks like it's suggesting products, so maybe just make one hero image that really kind of drives the value propositions home and encourages visitors to click on the shopping page. The other thing I'm going to encourage is that, let's see if I can bring this up on this other page. So we looked at the source code on this website, and there's a lot of scripts. So I'm going to encourage them to move these scripts down to the bottom of the page in the footer. That'll improve that page load. So you can see that doing a mobile-friendly audit is primarily 2 things. 1 is user interface, and 2 is page load. So if you can improve those 2 things, it's going to help a lot with your mobile-friendly rankings. So use gtmetrics.com, Google's mobile-friendly test. And another one, before I let you go, that I often use is, it's called Responsivator. This doesn't give you specific insights, like it doesn't give you a list excuse me, of what to fix, but what it does is it allows you to see a website on different resolutions. And so let's paste this here. And so then you can actually see what your website looks on these different screens, and then this will help you improve the user interface. So here's 1280 by 800 or larger, 1024 by 768. So you can see, you know, a minimal desktop size, tablet sizes, vertical or horizontal. Sorry, there's some delay when I'm recording. And then you can see on a mobile device. So you can actually see what it looks like and what your customers might be seeing, and identify problems with the user experience and fix that. And the way that benefits mobile friendliness is the longer people stay on your website, the more it improves your bounce rate. And the better bounce rate you have, Google identifies your website as a more valuable website, and so that's going to contribute to better rankings as well. So I hope that helps. Mobile friendly audit. Good luck. Thanks, Outrink.